And on the 26th of May 1991, Avis, his wife, died at Condura Road. She is sadly missed by the family and by the many patients she cared for at Camborne and Tahiti Chest Hospital over the years. Then in 1923, it was my turn to go to school to suffer the complexities of reading, writing and arithmetic. I was taken under escort. Just a little relaxing of that grip and I was off home. This happened regularly. And Mother would say, "Well, what is it this time?" "Oh," I would say, "the school is on fire." And soon Gary and Stanley Main would come for me and back I would go. I was quite proud to know that it took two big fellas to get me back. Well, I didn't learn much at school, but I certainly taught the teachers a thing or two. My first teacher was Miss Spurway. A lot rested on her shoulders, but she was a gentle soul and guided us through our first hesitant years. Now we can see some speaking school groups from about the 1920s. I don't know all of them, but in the back row, and the first boy on the right is Alfred Trenier, and the second row, and the fourth girl from the left is Delphine Johns. Third row, the girl fifth from the left is Zenith Weeks, and the second boy from the right is Ronald Dean. And in the front row, there's a colonel on the far right there, I think, David Piper's mother. But I can't recall any of the others. And in this group, there's Miss Keast left at the back, and then there's Miss Hart, Ernie Eva, the boy Eddie. I don't know the next one. The next one is Owen Eva. And then there's the Stevens from Tulcarn, the girl I don't know, and then there's Miss Pengelly. The second row, fourth in from the left, is Andrew Curnow, and the second from the right is the boy Pierce, who used to live down at the bottom of Beacon Hill. And in the front row, there's the second one in from the left is the girl Johns. Then there's Ella King and Telver Kent. The next one I don't know is, and then there's Charlie Curnow, who's the third one in from the right. And in this photograph, there's Miss Spurway on the left, and I think the second child along may be Ella King, and then the fifth girl along is a Skewis, and the second row down, the fourth boy in from the left is a Stevens from Tulcarn, and then two more along and it's Cecil Skewis, Albert Kitchen, and on the far right is Jack Edwards. And the front row, I can see, I think, Joe Medlin, and third from the right is Ben Simons, who lived down at Nave Goodbye. Well, at the back row, there's Miss Pengelly, and then Mavis Charles, girl Bennett's from Nave Goodbye, and at the end of that row, there's the girl Johns. The second row down, second one in is Glen Eva, and the front row, the third in is Ella King. Dennis Nichols, Charlie Johns, and not the next one I don't know, but the next one is Dorothy Menheniot, and I'm not sure about the last two in that row. Well, this is the class of 1923. In the back there's Miss Pengelly, and fourth along is Dorothy Nichols. I don't know the next. Then there's Ben Simons and Ernie Eva looking at him, and Miss Keast. And the second row, fifth in, is Betty Wills, and then there's her sister Winnie. I don't know the next one. Then there's Delphine Johns and my sister Betty. And the front row, the second one in is the Nichols. The fourth one is Charlie Johns. And then there's Phyllis Menheniot and Marjorie Bennett, I think from Nave Goodbye, holding the board. And then there's Ella King. And the next one I don't know. And then there's me and the girl Edwards. And the last girl, front row on the right, is Phyllis Nichols. Well, hello. No. Well, one often wonders what happened to classmates after they left school, and how it is that some names are remembered while others are completely forgotten. Now let me see if I can recite this group. There's third one in from the left at the back is Albert Kitchen, and then there's Stanley Main, Ernie Eva, I'm not sure of the next one, then there's Cecil Skewis, and then there's Verdon Kitchen, and then the next row down far left is Howard Bennett's, and then there's Miss Edwards, Miss Skewis, Boy Tunnicliffe, my sister Betty, and in the front row on the left there's me, and 1, 2, 3, 4, there's 5 in is 6th in is Betty Medlin, 5th in is a girl Morris, and far right is Jack Medlin, and beside Jack is Ella King. Now how's that for a memory? And still they come, 1926 group, this one. And on the far left, I can't see his head, but the next one I think is Morley Richards. And fourth in from the left, including the bloke with no head, is Glen Eva. And the second row is Emma Stevens. And then there's Avril Hart in the black dress centre of that group. And Dorothy Menheniot. The others aren't too clear, but in the front row there's 1, 2, 3, fourth one in is Dennis Nichols, and I think that's another young Nichols there sitting beside him. Might be Ivor. Now back in this group there's Dennis Nichols, and then there's a girl Wills. I think the fourth one is Glen Eva, and then there's a Mitchell, and the third in from the right is Dorothy Menheniot, and I think standing next to Dorothy Menheniot to the right is the girl Stevens from Tulcarn. And in the front row, the fourth one in looks like a Fidoc, maybe, but I don't know the others in that front row. Then in 1928, Renee Blackwell was born, and there she is with her father and mother at Prairie Sands in 1929. Well, like all the rest of us, she had to go to school too. And this is the class of 1934 at Beacon School. And I think there's Bernard Caddy at the back, Stella Richards, Veronica Blight is there in that row, Betty Thomas, and then there's Kenneth Pemberthy on the end. And there's Louis Stevens, alright, next row down on the left, and then there's Marjorie Mitchell, Joan Medlin, Lily Mae Hocking, Phyllis Bowden, Renee Blackwell, Vera Blewett, and Burl Johns. And on the bottom row, and there's Harry Moyle, we used to call him Stasher, Billy Cock, George Hocking, Marion Sowden, Peggy Mudge, Mona Hocking, Billy Mudge, Michael Dudley, and Stanley Hocking. Now this photograph, you'll see the third one from the left there is Georgie Hocking, and he married his childhood sweetheart Marion Penrose, who was second from the left in the back row of this picture. And about the same period, in the back row, fourth from the left, there's Sheila Williams, and the second one in from the right is Morley Richards. And the second row, third in, is Mona Hocking, and then there's Eileen Saul, that's right, and the very far right, if we can get him in, is Harry Moyle. And the front row, I think the second one in from the left, and he looks like a young Fisher. (1936) Beacon School, and the back row, I think on the left is Michael Dudley, and the other boy is called Peter something, I don't know, I've forgotten. Then there's Louis Bennett and Jean Keast, Vera Blewett, Jean Berryman, and Rex Williams. And then there's Morley Richards, and in front of Morley is Stanley Uren. And the second row, you can only just see a part of him, Cyril Jennings, and then there's Ruby Pierce, Sheila Williams, Joan Wills, Marion Sowden, and there's a girl Hocking, and then there's Renee Blackwell, Sylvia Tuttle, Burl Johns, Jean Martin, and Mona Hocking. And the front row, there's Eileen Saul, Billy Bennett's, there's a boy there called Keast, and then there's Stanley Hocking, and Stanley Fidock, Raymond Martin, and Hillary, then there's Cedric Caddy, and Jean Jose. Well, I will show you this close up, and there's Rex Williams on the far right at the back row, and it was a dreadful shock for Howard and Nellie and his sister Sheila when he was killed in a motorcycle accident, I think in 1949. He was the most pleasant of young men in his early 20s who had gone to the School of Mines and in India for a time. He left a widow and a young son. The whole village mourned Rex. Troon School, 1937. Back row, Myrtle Berryman, Marjorie Tippett, a girl called Moyle, Dorothy Penrose, Nancy Stevens, Dorothy Peters, Dorothy Taylor, and Theresa Sedgman. And the second row, and there's Vera Bray. I think the next girl was called Bartle, Iris Sedgman, June Thomas, Milo Berryman, Jean Tremaine, Ruby Pierce, Emma Stevens, and Rainey Blackwell, and Marion Barker. And in the front row, there's Lillian Edwards, Jean Berryman, Ruth Caddy, and Joan Medlin. You remember her mother kept a shop up in 4th Street in Beacon. Then there's Sylvia Penlyric, Louis Richards, S. Yates, Joan Rodda, and Eileen Carter. Now this is Beacon School. I'm not sure of the year, but in the back row on the left there's Billy Pierce. And second one in from the right is Kevin Wake, Tom and Hilda's son. And the second row down, the girl in the middle is Shirley Johns from Tulcarn. And in the front row, I think the third one in is Ronnie Dado. And the second one in from the right is Ken Fisher. And the boy on the far right is another Dado. Well, here's a motley crew. This was Troon School Concert, Christmas, 1937. Now, the little fellow with the piano accordion is Jim Dunstan. And his father was Bawden Dunstan, a brother to Harry. And next to him there's Jack Williams. Then there's Ken Barter. And the last one at the back row on the right is Freddie Moyle. And then there's John Vincent, Fred Nile, and Ken Hocking in that picture. And Harry Drugaskas and Kenneth Hart. I think Harry Drugaskas is the guy right in the front smoking the pipe. In 1936, after much hard work, a new cricket field was ready for play in Beacon. But before the season began, the old men of the village gathered to voice the wisdom of their opinions about it all, and they were listened to intently by a couple of the younger generation, Ronnie Weeks and Stanley Uren. You see them sitting on the grass, bottom right. Now in this picture, it's not very clear, but never mind. Far left is Willie Bowden, that's Edith Bowden's brother. And the next one along, I'm not sure, but then there's Mr. Cock. And the gentleman with the beard is Bill Biddick's father. Right? And then there's Mr. Richards, the boot and shoe repairman, Farmer Moyle, Pentecost Richards, he used to drive the steamroller for the council, and then there's Mr. Cook, who used to live in the square. I think he married Mrs. Curnow. And then there's Tom Williams, we call him Tommy Cole, and sitting there in the front smoking his pipe is Fred Negus. Now you'll notice the concrete blocks are ready for the pavilion, which was being brought from Ernie Joseph's field at Wheel Harriet. Well, the pavilion is now resting on the blocks, and the official opening was performed by Captain Kelly, He's the far right man nearest the pavilion. And along to the left, in front of the pavilion, there's Ernie Thomas, Tom Hosking, Tom Rashley, and I'm next in the light suit. And there on the, just in from the left, is Mr. Goldsworthy and his wife. And at the top of the picture on the left there, you can just see a bit of Beacon Stack. Well, that was the... And this is Beacon Cricket Team 1936. In the back row, there's Arthur Weeks, Fred Phillips, Andrew Curnow, the scorer, Bill Biddick. I should know the name of the next fella, but I haven't got it. Charlie Pascoe, and Freddie Vivian, and Mr. Cock. And the second row, from the left, there's Ernie Thomas, Tom Hosking, Bill Cock, Gordon Kitchen, Glenn Bennett, and Stanley Dunn. And in the front, there's Cecil Kent and a Fidock. And this is pretty well the same side, but with some extras in. There on the far left is Mr. Bryant, and on the far right is Bert Hampton, and the chairman of the club is Mr. Tyack. They're sitting down in the centre. And going out to bat for Beacon, about 1937, on the veranda there's Walter Charles, Bill Cock, myself. Then there's Bill Biddick, Arthur Kemp, and Leonard Hocking. And the batsman, Gordon Kitchen, on the left, and Stanley Dunn on the right. Now we can get away from cricket for a minute to catch this crowd. On the back, left to right, there's a half of Arthur Kemp, Joe Glanville, Kenneth Trevarthen, Tom Wake, and Lauren Dennis, Jack Thomas, the milkman in the back, Nicky Truscott, Stanley Main, and one of the Fall Boys. And in the front, there's Doris Glanville, Hilda Curnow, she's now Mrs. Hilda Wake, Stanley Dunn, Beatrice Glanville, and Gladys James. And who the end girl is, if she would turn, I would tell you. And this is the first sports days that they held in the new cricket field, 1936. And back row, the second one in from the left is Nancy Dean, and the fourth one is Zenith Weeks. Well, she became Zenith Veal. And then there's Ruth James, and then Violet Noble, Doris Glanville, and Doreen Weeks, who of course is George Clements' wife. And then in the front row I can see Thelma Kent there, 1, 2, 3, 4, the fifth in from the right, and the second boy in from the right is a boy Penberthy. Mrs. Curnow, who could throw a rolling pin further than anybody else and drive a 6-inch nail faster than anyone in the West, she's there on the left in the dark coat. And also in the picture, you might remember the names, Polly Simons, there's Miss Skewis, Stella Moyle, and just in front here, to the bottom left, is the Stevens boy from Tulkarn. Mrs. James is there, and Zenith and Doreen Weeks, Ruth James, Dickie Dunn, and Ronnie Vivian is over there. You see the end of the house, and he's right down with a white shirt. That's him. Now in the centre foreground you can see Norman Bennett's, and his brother, if I remember rightly, was called William James. And how sorry I felt for Norman. He spent years in the trenches during the First World War, only to lose his son Glenn serving in the Navy in 1942, and his other son Howard killed in an accident in Cross Street some years ago. Now there are far too many in this photograph to read out, but on the left, right at the left bottom, there's William John Bennett's. And then if you move along a little in the white hat, the Panama, there's Kara Roberts. And if you come across to the right of the picture, there's Bill Goldsworthy reading his program. Well, there we can have a close-up of Norman Bennett and his brother. And this is the egg and spoon race. And there in the centre of the picture is Pearl Biddick. On the left, facing the runners, is Sid Negus. And on the right is Leslie Moyle. There's Tom Hoskin there with him. And Kara Roberts. Biggin sports were a great success for a village, better than most in Cornwall, and their success was due more than anything to one man whose organising abilities were quite exceptional, Arthur Weeks. His contacts with manufacturers of first-class commodities of all descriptions ensured prizes not usually seen at sports events. His powers of persuasion to get these prizes was remarkable. In his later years, his hobby was to paint miniatures on the inside covers of matchboxes, the texture of which was ideal for that purpose. And Arthur died at the age of 90, I believe in 1981. And he's seen here enjoying his hobby. And Arthur Weeks was a fine man. Well, Arthur was ably and loyally supported by his wife and family. And this is his wife, Gladys Maud. Well, there were other willing helpers, like this group. And on the platform there's Zenith Weeks, and then there's Arthur, Leonard Hawking, Joe Glanville, Nancy Dean. But I can't recall the name of the man on the far right. And there's that little old pavilion again. Well, this happy group at Kildare Burrows, you can see the engine house there in the background. You know, we're always being watched over by engine houses. On the left is Doreen Weeks, Zenith, and Vi Hawking, who later married Hughie Biddick. And then in the middle row, on the left, there's Ronnie Weeks, Kenneth Williams, and Ronnie Williams. They were the sons of Sam, who lived there in Kildare Road. And then in the front row, there are two Haywood boys. They used to live up at Green Lane Hill, and I think their father was a master baker. And then there's Cedric Williams, and on the far right, front row, is Glenn Weeks. This is Bassett Road School soccer team, 1936-1937. Now in the back of the middle row is Ben Uren, who used to live down at Nave Goodbye. You'll remember him. And in the front row, second in from the left, is Ronnie Weeks. And The second one in this picture from the right is Basil Trevarthen. And I think the boy who should be in this picture is Frank Harris. Zenid, George, and Doreen. I won the 100 yards race a couple of times in the 30s at Beacon Sports. And then, of course, there were other sports like rugby. And I went to Troon and played wing 3/4 just before the war. And in this side, back left to right, there's Roach, Arthur Kemp, Jenkins, Leslie Skewis, Leslie Nile, Kenny Tresidder, and the middle row at the left there's Thomas, H.C. Blackwell, Glenn Webb, Morris Belitho, Jack Ward, and Williams. And in the front row on the left there's Wills, Fall, and Tommy Dado. In 1939, some of us from Beacon made a visit to South Crofty Mine and went underground. In the back row, there's H.C. Blackwell. I don't know the second one in. And then there's Stanley Main, Sid Negus, Nurse Melody, Betty Blackwell. And in the front, there's Percy Williams, as Arthur Weeks' brother-in-law, Irving Blackwell, Arthur McCarthy, and William Truscott. Well, it was gloomy underground. And then on Sunday the 3rd of September 1939, we were plunged into a deeper gloom, a war to rid the world of maniacs. And next morning, I went to Devonport and joined the Navy. Ladies, no proposals, please. I am already spoken for. Several times, in fact. Well, after a few months' training, I joined the aircraft carrier Furious, and some of our experiences were giving aircraft cover to convoys, the battle for Norway, taking fighters to Narvik, getting bombed in Tromsø Fjord, a couple of Malta convoys, transporting aircraft to West Africa to be flown to Wavell in North Africa. And in 1940, when on a Christmas morning, we were attacked by German cruisers. November 1942 saw us taking part in the invasion of North Africa, where our aircraft gave excellent cover to Allied forces making the landings. And here you see me leaning on the rail of the Furious on the Clyde, gathering that great convoy for North Africa. And off to sea. This ship, the Furious, was built in 1917 as a heavy cruiser, but was soon converted for use as a carrier. Very fast, with a speed of 32 knots, we often carried out missions without any escort. And the Dawn Patrol, preparing Swordfish aircraft for takeoff in search for hostile submarines or enemy surface ships. They could cause havoc with a large convoy, and this one had to be especially protected because it was on its way to North Africa. Well, in between times, we managed to get some leave, and this is 1940, when Glenn Bennett was home, Percy Mitchell, second from the left, myself, and Bill Cock, who was in the fire service at that time, and my brother Gary Blackwell in the merchant service. And at the favourite leaning post, left to right, there's Bill Bowden, Joe Glanville, Irving Blackwell, Glenn Bennett, Gary Blackwell, Percy Mitchell, Sidney Negus, Leonard Hawking, and kneeling, Bill Cock and Mr. Mitchell. You see the iron railings which were removed later on to make guns to kill more people. And this is Stanley Main, Tetherhampton, Gary Blackwell, Leslie Skewis, and Sidney Negus. And outside the Pendarvis Arms with Ronnie Olds, the landlord, and William Truscott. It was always good to meet up with Beacon boys again. And in this photograph, Kenneth Dunstan from Tullocarn is on the left, with Howard Bennett, who I mentioned earlier was killed in that accident in Cross Street. And I'm sitting in the front. And at the back, on the left, is Rose Vere. He was a radio operator in the merchant service. And then on the right there's Edgar Evans. He was the barman at Tyack's Hotel. Friendly soul, always ready with a glass of beer for the boys. And front left is a seaman called Cocking from Tuckermill, who survived the blasting and sinking of the Prince of Wales by the Japanese in the Far East. He was in a terrible shape and died not long after the war. Now the Furious was bombed in a fjord in Norway, causing damage which required extensive repair, including new engines. Fortunately, we shot the attackers down and managed to hobble back to Scapa Flow. And then at the end of 1941, we went to Philadelphia Navy Yard for refit, and during our stay we were given leave to visit any relatives in America. So off I went to Detroit and Flint to stay with my cousin Gwenny Williams, that's Gwenny Main, and Walter Main, who came down from Chicago to meet me. And what a splendid reunion. And here I am with Walter and Leonard Williams, that's Gwenny's husband, at Flint in November 1941. Now when we were refitting in Philadelphia, who should join the crew but my cousin John Williams? And we would go ashore together when the opportunity occurred. We sort of kept an eye on each other to see that neither one of us got into any mischief, as if we would. Well, John came through it all in one piece, and as you'll see, he made a very good job of life after the war. And here he is with his wife Frances and their children, and I gather that that's one of their children, their daughters being married. In 1943, I left the Furious after 3 years and 3 months to return to Devonport for refresher courses and manage the occasional weekend leave. And down in the cricket field, I met Ivor Dunstan, who was serving in the paratroopers. Remember his father Harry kept a farm over at Tullocarn? Well, after the war, Ivor went to the Cameron School of Mines and worked overseas for some years, and he is now retired and living at Mevagizzy. Early in June 1943, outside of Pendarvis Arms, my father on the left, and Mr. Pellow, and that boy Stevens from Tulcarn, Ronnie Oles, who was in the Home Guard, and then there's me, and Bill Biddick, and then Arthur Kemp, who was later to join the army. And then behind Arthur is Percy Andrews. He used to sell fruit and vegetables around with a wagon. And on the far right is Johnny Ivor, and sitting in the front is my brother Irving. Many Beacon men served in the armed forces, and if I omit to mention any one of them, I am sorry. But everyone was involved in one way or another, and they were tragic times. But what a wonderful feeling of belonging together. Some of you might remember the Tridal family who lived at Pendower Terrace. Well, this is Rear Admiral John Tridal, or everyone called him Jan, a distant relative of mine and a very good friend. Now, his father served his apprenticeship at Holman's and then attended the School of Mines before going to the Kolar goldfields in India, where Jan was born in 1914. Well, the Admiral retired to Taunton, where he died in 1990. And another seafarer, Donald Bennett, seen there with his friend. Cecil Thomas. Well, you all know Tom Bowden. Well, he was in North Africa when I was there, but I couldn't pick him out for the crowd. Tom married Alverna Hocking, and they live across the road from me. And Tom's brother David, he played his part. And brother Bill in the Air Force, and Bill married Alverna's sister Lily, and they lived at Cadogan Road, but unfortunately both died. And Sergeant Bowden, reading the West Briton and the Royal Cornwall Gazette. We used to get them sent to us when we were serving abroad. And another young Beacon lad, Sergeant Ivor Nichols, Royal Army Ordnance Corps, and he was at Anzio in Italy, which you will know was a bloody place to be in. But fortunately, he survived. In 1943, I joined HMS Guardian, a ship designed for special purposes, which I won't go into. So we sailed for Gibraltar, and with other units of the fleet were preparing for the invasion of Sicily. Well, some enemy sympathizers, saboteurs, got into the base at Gibraltar, and they put charges underneath us and exploded them and set us on fire. The ship was abandoned except for a handful of us who fought the fires, flooded the ammunition holes, and got lines to a tug which towed us out into the open waters in case we blew up. Well, eventually we put the fires out. I stayed on board, and we returned to harbour. And within a week, working night and day, we were ready and sailed to Sicily. And this photograph was taken from the tug, and it shows us on fire. And what a mess we were in. And Gleneva, another Beacon boy, he's shown here on the left, served in the tank corps and was badly wounded in one of the heavy tank battles known as Knightsbridge in North Africa. Recovering, he went to Sicily for the invasion, where he was again wounded, and this time he was transferred to hospital in Algiers. Now, HMS Guardian took part in the invasion of Sicily and Italy, and in between times, being well suited as a convoy protector, we covered the whole of the Mediterranean from Gibraltar to Malta, ports in North Africa, down to the Red Sea, Beirut, and we would have called in at Algiers when Glenn was recovering there. But unfortunately, had no knowledge of each other's whereabouts. Otherwise, I would have called to see my old friend. But there was one Beacon man I did meet under very strange circumstances, which are too long to fully relate here. I was in Brindisi in 1943, before the army had occupied the town, and who should come marching in but Albert Negus. You know, he used to live just across the road from me in 4th Street. Well, we had a brief meeting, but he was puzzled as to how I was there before the army got in. But then that's a long story. But we were very pleased to see each other, and after the war, if he saw me, he would always call out, "And how's Brindisi?" And I would say, "Okay." In late 1944, I was transferred to a Fleet Air Arm Station, HMS Grebe at Tequila, about 15 miles west from Alexandria. Here, carrier pilots were being trained for the Far East. So while I was there, I made a visit to Cairo, where I knew there were some Cameron men, and Willie Truscott was there. And here we are on the banks of the Nile. And when in Cairo, I was invited to join the Cairo Cornish Association, whose secretary was Silas Bath. Now, his people kept a dairy shop in Chapel Street for some years. You'll probably remember them. Sadly, wars cost lives. And my sister Marion's husband, Hugh McGeorge, was first mate on board the SS Stornest when it was torpedoed in the Atlantic on the 13th of October 1942. He was a fine man and is greatly missed by all the family. And this is Glenn Bennett from Beacon Square, known by many as the Professor. He served his apprenticeship at Holman's and was killed in 1942, serving on HMS Victorious, the aircraft carrier, in the Pacific. Well, this greetings card for Christmas 1991 and the New Year was the last he sent. Glenn and I went to school together and played cricket, and we were great friends. And Jack Medlin, Sergeant Gunner in the Royal Air Force, was killed in North Africa in 1942. Now, you know, his mother and father kept the shop in 4th Street, and we too were friends, and he was a very popular young man. There are 3 graves just inside the gates at Troon Cemetery. The headstones speak for themselves. S.V. Kemp, Royal Signals, killed on the 11th of November 1942, and he lived in the cottage just where the road to Troon turns off to Newton. Well, the cottage too is gone. And this is Private A. Pierce, who lived in the Tulkarn mine count house, and he died in 1946 at the age of 23. And E.F. Penlerick, seaman, Naval Patrol Service, killed on the 21st of April 1945. He just didn't make it, and so near to victory. And the War Memorial at Treslothan remembers the dead of both World Wars. And here you see the names of S. Kemp and H.D. McGeorge, amongst many others. In 1985, the Russian government issued this medal commemorating 40 years since a brutal German invasion of their country. They remembered those of us who came to their assistance, especially in Arctic waters, when they were hard-pressed to survive. And this medal and certificate came to me in November 1992 through the good offices of the British Admiralty, with a letter which reads, "Good morning, Mr. Blackwell. Please find a translation of the certificate." The top left says, 40 years of victory in the Great Patriotic War, 1941-1945. And at the bottom, to a participant in the war, and top right, certificate to Blackwell H.C. At the bottom, the stamp of the President of the USSR, 31st of July, 1991. Better late than never, but I am pleased that they remembered. When serving on HMS Furious, we spent many months in the Arctic during the Norwegian campaign and off the north coast of Finland and Russia. Now, weather conditions were at times atrocious. Blizzard conditions, mountainous seas, and at times so bad that aircraft flown off on raids were unable to locate us and were lost at sea. Well, this photograph gives some impression of what things were like. They were cold and they were bloody awful. But in spite of all this, I think I preferred it to life in Civvy Street, with blackouts, long hours at work, mainly on munitions, home guard or civil defense duties after working hours, food shortages, rationing, air raids, without the means to hit back, worrying about those of us who were away. Well, people at home did their duty, and here we remember Beacon Home Guard. I'm not sure that I can recall all their names, but the back row, far left, might be a Lob, and second one in is Morley Stevens, and the fourth one is Harry Moyle, and then I see Bert Hampton, and there's a fellow from Nave Goodbye, Then there's Leonard Pierce. And the second row down, the fifth one in from the left is Ewart Thomas. And then there's Bill Simmons, Joe Glanville, and second one in from the right is Mr. Reed. And the gentleman on the far right lived at Navegaby, and I can't call his name. And in the front row on the left, there's Jack Negus, there's Mr. Pierce, and far right is Castwright Kitchen, and then the next one in is Bill Biddick and Bill Climo. Now I'll bring them in a little closer and go along the line, and you will be able to pick out who they are. And there on the far right is our Navegaby gentleman, and the name will come to me too late. And the Civil Defence Corps. Now this is quite a large picture, and I had some difficulty to take it with my camera, but Sid James and Leslie Trees are in the back row. And there's George Eustace in the middle row, Ben Thomas, Willie Hampton, and Seymour Blewett. And in the front row left there's a Thomas, and number 9 along is Donald Thomas, the solicitor. But I'll bring these up for you as well, because I think they're worth a look at. Well, there we are. You can see Sidney James on the far left back row, and the third one in is Leslie Trees. And the second row down, I know the fourth fellow in from the left is Frank Heyman. His brother was MP here for Cameron and Redruth many years, and next to him is Mr. Prisk. There's a couple of troon men in that back row. Morris Blytho is there. Fifth one in from the right. And the second one in from the left in the front row, I think, was Cola Holman. And there in the middle row, the third one in from the left is Seymour Blewett, and there's Bill Hampton and our friend Ben Thomas. Oh yes, and the third one in from the right is George Eustace in that second row. So remember them. The Holman brothers played a part in this last war, and they designed the Holman projector. Well, one of the main men behind that gun was Dick Gilbert. He's seen here facing the camera, and he was involved in the design and manufacture of the Holman projector, a gun operated by compressed air to fire Mills grenades. Trials in 1940 resulted in an order for 1,000 of these, and shortly after that the first success damaging a Heinkel bomber which was attacking a trawler. A steam-operated gun was also produced and fitted on a large number of warships and merchant ships. When low-flying enemy aircraft met this kind of defence, where the exploding grenade gave the illusion of much greater power, there was lots of smoke, they invariably broke off the attack. Well, after the war, Dick Gilbert was awarded the British Empire Medal for his work with the gun and other projects, and here he is being congratulated by fellow Holman's men. The medal is pinned to his lapel. Just behind him is Arthur Thomas, and a fellow called Eddie Quintrell is at the back, and in front of him there's Sixer Adams, and you remember Fred Head, he's far left, and looking over his shoulder is Mr. Brewer, who lived at Cadogan Road. And this is Dickie Gilbert's family, Cyril and Dolly, with their little puppies, about 1922. And they lived at Cadogan Road.
Doctor Who, tomorrow at 7:10 on BBC One. And if you missed the last episode, it's available now on BBC iPlayer.